The email came on a Thursday morning 3 months after I had quit, and it was from the CEO of the company I had left. And his name was in my inbox next to the subject line consultation inquiry. And I sat at my kitchen table in the apartment I had, converted into a home office, and I read it twice. And it said he had been referred to my new practice by a mutual contact and that he was looking for an organizational strategy consultant for a 6-month engagement and that he had heard very good things. And would I be available to meet? And I thought about the afternoon. I had announced my resignation to my team of 12 people, and the specific sound that had gone around the room, which was not quite laughter, but was close enough that I had felt it. And I thought about my manager, Greg, who had said, "Vivian, are you sure about this? Because independent consulting is a very difficult market." And I had said, "I'm sure, Greg," and he had said, "We can find something better for you here." And I had said, "I've already made my decision." And he had said, "Well, I hope it works out." And the way he said, "I hope it works out," was the way people say things when they do not actually hope that. And I thought about all of that sitting at my kitchen table, reading the CEO's email, and then I opened a new message, and I wrote back, and I said, "I would be delighted to schedule a consultation. Hey, everyone. Welcome back." And okay, if you are brand new here today, I want you to know that this story is one of those ones where the universe just handled it, so I didn't have to, which is my favorite kind of story to tell because it requires the least amount of planning on my part and produces the most satisfying result. So pull up a chair. My name is Vivian Marsh, and I am 31 years old. And 14 months ago, I quit a corporate strategy role at a mid-size consulting firm where I had worked for 5 years to start my own independent practice. And the reaction from my colleagues when I announced that decision was the specific mixture of concern and condescension that people deploy when they want to seem supportive while actually communicating that they think you are making a mistake. And I want to walk through that reaction and what happened after it, because the distance between those two moments is the entire story. I had been at Hartwell Consulting for 5 years when I decided to leave. And I want to be clear that the decision was not impulsive, and was not emotional, and was not the result of any single incident, but rather a deliberate conclusion I had been building toward for about 18 months, based on a clear-eyed assessment of what I wanted my professional life to look like, and what it was actually going to look like if I stayed, and what it was going to look like if I stayed was more of the same, meaning I would continue doing excellent work that was presented to clients under the firm's name and the partners' faces, while my own name appeared on internal documents and in small print on deliverables, and I would continue building expertise that made the firm more valuable without building a practice that made me more independent. And I had decided at 30 that I did not want to spend my 30s doing what I had spent my late 20s doing. And so I had spent 6 months building the infrastructure for my own practice before I resigned, and by the time I walked into Greg's office with my letter, I had a website, a service offering, a pricing structure, and 2 warm leads from former colleagues who had moved to new companies and mentioned they might need the kind of work I did. The announcement happened at a team meeting, which I had asked Greg to let me address. And Greg had said, of course, thinking I was going to share good news. And I had shared the news, which was that I was leaving to start an independent organizational strategy practice. And I had given 4 weeks' notice. And I had thanked the team genuinely for 5 years of real professional collaboration. And the reaction that went around the room was the one I described earlier, which was not quite laughter, but had the same energy as laughter, which is the energy of people deciding something is not serious. And the specific comments I heard in the 2 weeks that followed included my colleague Dana saying, "I just worry you're giving up stability for something that might not work out," and my colleague Patrick saying, "Independent. Consulting is really hard to break into unless you have a strong book of business already," and my colleague James, who had been at the firm for 11 years and showed no signs of leaving, saying, "Vivian, I think you have a lot of potential here, and it would be a shame to throw that away on something uncertain." And I had listened to all of it and said, "Thank you for the concern," and continued packing my desk. The first 3 months were genuinely difficult. in the way that any new thing is difficult when you are building it from nothing. And I want to be honest about that because the story is not that it was easy. The story is that it was hard, and I kept going. And what kept going looked like was sending 43 cold outreach messages in the first month and getting 4 responses, refining my positioning based on what resonated, having 6 preliminary calls that converted into 2 paid engagements, building those 2 engagements into case studies, and using those case studies to generate 3 more inquiries. And by month 3, I had a practice that was generating enough revenue to cover my costs comfortably and enough momentum that I had. Stopped worrying about whether it would work and started thinking about how to grow it. And that is when the CEO's email arrived. His name was Christopher Alderman, and he was the CEO of Hartwell Consulting, meaning he was the CEO of the company I had left 3 months earlier, and the mutual contact who had referred me was a former Hartwell client who had moved to a new organization and had worked with me directly on a project 2 years earlier, and had remembered my work specifically, and had recommended me to Christopher for a leadership alignment engagement his executive team needed. And the referral had gone through the former client's network without anyone connecting my name to Hartwell specifically until Christopher looked me up and saw my previous employer listed on my profile, and I know this because he mentioned it. In the meeting was at a coffee shop I had suggested, and Christopher arrived on time, which I respected, and he was direct, which I also respected, and he said, "I should tell you, I noticed you worked at Hartwell until recently," and I said, "I left 3 months ago to start this practice." And he said, "I know," and he said, "I'm going to be transparent with you. I heard about your departure from Greg," and he described it as, "you pursuing something uncertain." And I said, "That sounds like Greg and Christopher said," and then my colleague recommended you specifically, and I said, "That sounds like good timing," and he said, "It does." Look, what I'm looking for is someone who can work with my leadership team on organizational alignment, because we're going through a structural transition, and I need someone outside the firm who doesn't have existing relationships with any of the players. And I said, "That's actually a natural fit for an independent practitioner." And he said, "I'm aware of that, which is partly why I'm here." And I said, "Tell me more about the transition." And he did, and I listened the way I always listen, which is carefully and without performing. And by the end of the conversation, he said, "I think you're exactly what we need." And I said, "I think so too," and we agreed on a scope and a rate. And I sent the contract the following morning. The engagement started 2 weeks later and ran for 5 months. And I want to be honest that it was some of the most substantive work I had done in my career. The organizational challenges Christopher's team was navigating were real and complex and required exactly the kind of thinking I had spent 5 years developing at Hartwell in precisely the context that Hartwell had never fully let me own. And I delivered it, and Christopher was satisfied. And at the end of the engagement, he wrote me a reference letter that said things about my work that I am still genuinely proud of. And he referred me to 2 other CEOs in his network. And those referrals became 2 more engagements, and by month 14 of my practice, I had 7 active clients and a waiting list and a revenue number that I am going to decline to share specifically, except to say it was significantly more than my Hartwell salary had been. Greg called me 7 months into the engagement, not knowing about Christopher, and he said, "Vivian, I heard you're doing well." And I said, "I am Greg." And he said, "I'm glad the practice worked out." And I said, "Thank you, Greg." And he said, "We actually have a client who might benefit from what you do. Would you be open to a referral conversation?" And I said, "I have availability in about 6 weeks. Greg, what's the timeline?" And he said, "Fairly urgent, actually." And I said, "Let me check my calendar." And I said, "I can fit a call in next Thursday." And Greg said, "Great." And he said, "Vivian, I want to say, I'm sorry I wasn't more supportive when you left." And I said, "I appreciate that, Greg." And I said, "The practice is doing well." And he said, "I can see that." And I said, "Thursday at 10 works for me." And we hung up, and I sat at my kitchen table, the same one where I had read Christopher's email, and I thought about the sound that had gone around the room the day I announced I was leaving. And I thought about Greg saying, "I hope it works out." And I thought about 7 active clients, and a waiting list, and Christopher Alderman's reference letter framed on my office wall. And I thought, some things you simply have to build before anyone will believe they were possible. And I think that is the truest sentence I have ever said about my professional life, and I think Greg would agree.